The bridge was on fire when I gave the order to retreat. Not a small fire, not a contained electrical flare behind a console panel. Half the starboard wall of my command deck had been torn open by a Drekar plasma lance, and the atmosphere recyclers were screaming as they fought to compensate for the breach. My tactical officer Oreni was shouting damage reports through a haze of gray smoke, and every number she gave me was worse than the last. I am Commander Valen So of the Rithani Sovereignty, and 14 months into this war, I had become very good at losing. Engines at 41%, Oreni called out, her compound eyes scanning 3 data screens at once. Hull integrity on decks 9 through 14 is gone. We have fires in the port ammunition bay, and the secondary shield array is offline. I gripped the edge of my command rail and stared through the forward viewport at the carnage outside. Sithara Prime, a world of 12 million Rithani, was burning below us. The Drekar bombardment fleet hung in high orbit like a swarm of dark iron insects, their warships pouring fire into the cities we had sworn to protect. 3 of my escort frigates were already dead, their broken hulls tumbling through the orbital debris field in silence. All ships, execute withdrawal pattern Sola 7, I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Set course for the Jurassic Corridor, maximum sustainable speed. There was a pause on the fleet channel. I knew what that pause meant. It meant every captain in my battle group was looking at Sithara Prime and understanding that we were leaving 12 million civilians behind. Confirmed, Commander, came the first reply. Then another, then the rest, one by one, each voice carrying the same weight of failure. We ran. The Drekar let us go. That was the worst part. They did not even bother to pursue, because we were not worth pursuing anymore. 14 months ago, the Rithani Sovereignty had fielded a navy of over 400 warships, a fleet built across 3 generations and crewed by the finest officers our civilization had ever produced. Today, I commanded 58 ships. Some of them were held together by emergency welds and desperate engineering. 58 ships against an empire that had already swallowed 6 star systems and showed no sign of stopping. I did not leave the bridge for 11 hours. Neither did Oreni. We stood in the smoke and the flickering emergency lighting and coordinated the retreat in silence, because there was nothing to say. We had lost Sithara Prime. Before that, we had lost Venar. Before that, Kesith and the Pale Reaches. The Drekar Dominion was eating our civilization alive, and no one in the galaxy was lifting a finger to stop it. When the last of my ships had cleared the immediate danger zone and entered the transit corridor toward Drassic, I finally allowed myself to sit down. The command chair creaked under my slight weight. Rithani are not large beings. We stand barely chest-high to most galactic species, our bodies built light and angular, our wings vestigial remnants of an evolutionary past we left behind long ago. We are thinkers, strategists, diplomats. We were never meant to fight a war of attrition against a species that bred soldiers the way factories produce ammunition. Commander, Oreni said quietly, stepping close so the bridge crew would not hear, I have completed the updated projections. Tell me, at our current rate of attrition, factoring in repair capacity and crew losses, the Sovereignty's military will cease to function as a coherent fighting force within 6 standard weeks. 6 weeks. That was all we had left. 6 weeks. And then the Drekar would reach Rithara itself, our homeworld, the cradle of everything my species had ever built or dreamed or loved. What about the Concord? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Oreni's wings twitched in the Rithani equivalent of a bitter laugh. The Galactic Concord has formally declared a position of non-intervention. The vote was unanimous. Unanimous. Every single member species of the galactic governing body had agreed that the Rithani were not worth saving. The Telluri, who had traded with us for centuries. The Voss hegemony, whose merchants grew rich on Rithani crystal exports. The Orani Collective, who once called us their closest allies. All of them had watched the Drekar tear us apart, performed their diplomatic calculations, and decided that the cost of helping was higher than the cost of watching us die. 3 of our former allies had gone further. The Peleni Federation, the Gresquim and the Sular Directorate had all signed non-aggression pacts with the Drekar. They had looked at the trajectory of this war determined that the Drekar would win, and chosen to buy their own safety with our silence. I could not even blame them. That was the rational choice, the strategic choice. In their position, with their populations and their interests, they had chosen survival over principle. But I was not in their position. I was standing on the bridge of a burning warship with 57 other damaged vessels behind me, and the only thing between the Drekar and my homeworld was a narrow corridor of space that we might be able to hold for a few weeks if every single thing went right. Nothing had gone right in 14 months. I stood up from the command chair and walked to the communications station. My comms officer, a young male named Seelith, looked up at me with wide, exhausted eyes. "Seelith, I need you to prepare a broad-spectrum distress signal, maximum power, omnidirectional broadcast." He blinked. "Commander, a broad-spectrum signal at maximum power will be detectable across multiple sectors. If the Drekar intercept it, they will know our position. They already know our position. Prepare the signal." "What frequency range?" I paused. Every known species in our region of the galaxy had already declared their position. The Concord had spoken. Our allies had abandoned us. There was no one left to call, except the unknown. "Broadcast across all frequencies," I said. "Standard galactic emergency encoding, but also include every alternative encoding protocol we have on file. Aim the primary beam beyond the outer veil." Oreni turned sharply. "The outer veil? Commander, no charted civilization exists beyond the veil. Exploration probes have been sent into that region for decades, and none have ever returned with evidence of intelligent life." "Then we are sending a message to no one," I said. "And if no one answers, we will have lost nothing. But if someone is out there, someone the Concord does not know about, someone who has no treaties with the Drekar, and no reason to fear them, then perhaps they will hear a dying civilization asking for help." Oreni stared at me for a long moment. Then she dipped her head in acknowledgement. Selith prepared the signal. It was simple, because simplicity was all we could afford. It contained our coordinates, the nature of our emergency, the size of the hostile force, and a single repeated phrase in every language and encoding we possessed. "We are under attack. We cannot survive alone. If anyone can hear this, we need help." The signal went out into the dark. I did not expect an answer. I want to be honest about that. I had been a military officer for 23 years, and I had long since learned the difference between strategy and prayer. This was prayer. This was the act of a desperate commander who had run out of rational options and was throwing words at the stars in the hope that something, anything, would answer. We reached the Drassic corridor 9 hours later. Drassic was a natural choke point, a narrow passage between two dense nebulae that limited approach vectors and negated the Drekar's numerical advantage. It was the last defensible position between the enemy and our homeworld. If we lost Drassic, there would be nothing between the Drekar fleet and Rathara but empty space and 12 billion civilians. I spent the next 2 days preparing our defenses. We mined the corridor approaches. We positioned our remaining ships in overlapping fields of fire. We repaired what we could and cannibalized what we could not. Every crew member who could hold a tool was working around the clock, and the ones who could not were helping coordinate supplies and communications from their bunks. Morale was a word that no longer applied to us. What we had was something quieter and harder, a grim refusal to stop moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding exactly how hopeless our situation was. On the evening of the second day, I stood alone in my quarters and looked at a hollow image of Rathara. Green continents, silver oceans, the faint shimmer of orbital stations catching the light of our home star. 12 billion lives. My parents lived in the coastal city of Velinor. My sister and her children lived in the highland settlements of Thessic province. 6 weeks. I closed my eyes and pressed my thin fingers against the viewport, feeling the cold of space seep through the reinforced glass. Somewhere out beyond the outer veil, my signal was traveling at the speed of light, multiplied by the reach of our most powerful transmitter. It was a whisper in an ocean, a spark in an endless dark. But it was all I had left to give. I returned to the bridge at dawn and began the preparations for what I believed, with complete certainty, would be our final stand. The Drekar arrived on the third day. They came in force. Not a raiding party, Not a scouting element, but a full offensive armada. 217 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the mouth of the Jurassic Corridor, their formation tight and aggressive, their weapons already powering up. At their center flew the Drekar command carrier, a monstrous vessel, nearly 3 kilometers long, bristling with enough firepower to level a continent. All ships, battle stations, I said, and across my fleet of 58 wounded vessels, crews ran to their posts for what everyone knew would be the last time. Oreni stood beside me, her data screens alive with red indicators. They are deploying in a standard envelopment pattern, she said. They intend to push through the corridor on 3 axes simultaneously. Our minefields will slow the flanking elements, but the central thrust will reach our main line within 20 minutes of engagement. I nodded. The math was simple. We were outnumbered nearly 4-1 by an enemy with superior tonnage, superior firepower, and no supply concerns. Our mines and the corridor's natural choke point were the only advantages we had, and they would buy us time, not victory. Open a channel to all ships, I said. The channel clicked open. 58 bridges, thousands of Rithani, standing at their posts, waiting. This is Commander Valen Saw, I said. You all know what is coming. You all know the odds. I will not insult you with false optimism. What I will tell you is this. Every minute we hold this corridor is a minute our families on Rithara have to prepare. Every shot we fire is a statement that the Rithani do not surrender. We have been abandoned by our allies. We have been written off by the Concord. But we are still here, and as long as we are here, they have not won. The channel was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, my captains acknowledged. Short, steady voices. No speeches, no dramatics. Just officers, telling their commander that they were ready to die at their posts. The Drekar fleet began its advance. Their lead elements entered the corridor, and my minefields detonated in sequence, bright flashes of white and orange rippling through the narrow passage. 4 Drekar destroyers were torn apart in the first wave of explosions. The rest kept coming. All batteries, open fire, I ordered. And the last battle of the Rithani sovereignty began. Our guns spoke. The Drekar answered. The corridor lit up with crossing beams of energy and the bright streaks of missile salvos, and ships began to die on both sides. I lost the frigate Tessalon in the first exchange, then the patrol cruiser Windborne 3 minutes later. The Drekar pushed forward through our fire with relentless mechanical discipline, their formation absorbing losses and closing the gap with terrifying speed. 10 minutes into the engagement, I had lost 9 ships. The Drekar had lost 14, but they had 200 more. 15 minutes in, 16 ships gone. My defensive line was buckling on the port flank, and the Drekar were pushing a heavy cruiser squadron through the gap. If they broke through, they would roll up our formation from the side, and it would be over. Oreni, I said, prepare the withdrawal order. Fallback point Rithara high orbit. We will make our last stand above the homeworld. She nodded, her hands moving across her console. Neither of us spoke the obvious. Withdrawing to Rithara meant the end. It meant days, not weeks. I reached for the fleet channel to give the order, and then Selith's console erupted with signals. Commander, he shouted, his voice cracking with a sound I had never heard from him before, something between terror and disbelief. I am detecting faster-than-light signatures, multiple contacts. Bearing 772, declination 15, far side of the corridor. I spun toward his station. Drekar reinforcements? No, Commander. His hands were shaking. These drive signatures do not match any known species in the galactic database. There are at least 40 contacts. They are decelerating now. 40 unknown ships, arriving in the middle of a battle, from a direction that pointed toward one place. The Outer Veil. The contacts resolved on our sensors one by one. They were unlike anything in our records. Blocky, angular vessels with thick armor plating, and none of the elegant curves that characterized galactic ship design. They bristled with what appeared to be kinetic weapon systems, massive magnetic accelerators lining their hulls, and heavy missile batteries clustered around their midships. They were ugly. They were brutal. They looked like someone had built warships out of pure aggression and bolted engines to the back. And then the signal came through. Not in Rithani. Not in Drekar or any galactic trade language. It came first in an unfamiliar tongue, harsh and muscular, and then a moment later, in accented but functional galactic common, the words slightly distorted by an imperfect translation matrix. This is Rear Admiral Graham Holt of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We received your distress signal. We are here to assist. Identify the hostile force, and we will engage. For 3 full seconds, no one on my bridge moved or breathed. Terran. I had never heard the word. It appeared nowhere in any database, any star chart, any diplomatic record. These were a species from beyond the veil, from the unmapped dark, a civilization that the entire galactic community did not know existed. And they had come because we asked. Sealith, I whispered. Respond. Tell them the Drekar fleet is the hostile force. 200 warships, bearing directly ahead of their current position. Sealith transmitted. The response from the Terran flagship came back in 4 seconds. Understood. Engaging now. Stay clear of our firing arcs. Holt out. No deliberation. No committee. No diplomatic review or threat assessment, or cost-benefit analysis. 4 seconds between hearing the enemy's description and the decision to fight. The Terran fleet accelerated. I have seen many things in this war. I have seen bravery, and I have seen cowardice. I have seen tactical brilliance and catastrophic failure, but I had never seen anything like what those Terran warships did in the next 6 minutes. They hit the Drekar's right flank at full speed, driving directly into the enemy formation like a fist through glass. Their kinetic batteries opened up at close range, launching solid projectiles at velocities that turned simple metal slugs into weapons of devastating force. The first Drekar heavy cruiser struck by a full Terran broadside simply came apart, its hull shattered as if it had been hit by a small asteroid. The Drekar formation, focused entirely on pushing through the corridor toward us, was caught completely off guard. Ships that had been pressing forward suddenly found themselves taking fire from an unexpected direction, from weapons they had never encountered, fired by a species they had never heard of. The Terran ships fought in a way that defied every tactical doctrine I had ever studied. They closed to ranges that Rithani captains would consider suicidal, absorbing hits from Drekar plasma lances that would have crippled our vessels, and kept firing. Their armor held. Their weapons roared. They moved with a coordinated ferocity that felt less like military precision and more like controlled fury. A Terran destroyer, smaller than any other ship in the engagement, was struck by 3 simultaneous plasma bolts and lost its forward section. The ship did not retreat. It rolled, presenting its intact weapons batteries, and continued firing as atmosphere vented from its wounds. I watched this from my bridge, with my mouth open. Commander, Oreni said softly, the Drekar formation is breaking. She was right. For the first time in 14 months of war, a Drekar offensive formation was falling apart. Ships were peeling off from the main body, trying to reorient to face this new threat, and in doing so, they were losing their coordinated push through the corridor. The pressure on my defensive line eased as Drekar captains struggled with the impossible choice of continuing their attack on a fortified position while an unknown enemy tore into their flank. All ships, I said, my voice steadier now than it had been in months. Advance and engage. Support the Terran fleet. Push them back. My 58 battered warships surged forward, and for the first time in this war, we were not retreating. The battle lasted another 40 minutes. The Drekar, caught between our defensive positions and the Terran assault, fought with their characteristic brutality, but could not recover from the shock of the ambush. They lost 31 ships before their fleet commander finally ordered a withdrawal. The remaining Drekar warships disengaged and fled back down the corridor, their formation ragged and broken. I stood on my bridge and watched them go. We had won. For the first time since the war began, we had won a battle. My hands were trembling, my wings, pressed flat against my back the way they always were during combat, slowly relaxed. Around me, my bridge crew stared at their consoles in stunned silence, as if they could not trust the data in front of them. Sealith, I said, open a channel to the Terran flagship. The connection crackled to life, and I heard a voice, deep and slightly rough with exhaustion, speaking Galactic Common with that same unfamiliar accent. This is Holt. Commander So, I presume. Yes, Admiral. On behalf of the Rithani sovereignty, I want to say. I stopped. The words tangled in my throat. What did you say to a stranger who appeared from the void and saved your civilization without being asked twice? Thank you, was a hollow phrase. You saved us, was incomplete. We received your distress signal 46 hours ago. Holt continued, as if he sensed my struggle and chose to fill the silence. We mobilized as soon as we confirmed the content. I have 43 warships and 8 support vessels under my command, and a larger fleet is being assembled back home. Whatever you are facing, you are not facing it alone anymore. 46 hours. They had received the signal, assessed it, assembled a fleet, and traveled across unknown space to fight in a stranger's war, all in 46 hours. The Galactic Concord had debated for 6 months, and voted to do nothing. Admiral Holt, I said carefully, I must be direct with you. We do not know your species. We do not know your civilization. No record of your people exists in any galactic database. How did you reach this decision so quickly? There was a brief pause. When Holt spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less firm. Commander, where we come from, when someone calls for help, you answer. That is not a complicated decision. We can discuss politics and treaties later. Right now, I would like to know the full tactical situation, because I have a feeling this war is not over yet. I closed my eyes. He was right. The war was not over. The Drekkar would regroup. They would come back with more ships and more fury, and the road to Rithara was still measured in weeks, not years. But for the first time in 14 months, the word hope had entered my vocabulary again. And it had arrived in the form of ugly, brutal, impossibly brave warships, crewed by a species that heard a stranger's cry for help and decided, in less than 2 days, that the only acceptable response was to fight. I did not know what a Terran was. I did not know where they came from, or what they wanted, or whether they could be trusted. But I knew what they had done. And in that moment, standing on the cracked and smoke-stained bridge of my dying flagship, watching the last Drekkar warships flee into the dark, that was enough. Admiral Holt, I said, I will transmit our full strategic briefing immediately. And I would like to request a face-to-face meeting at your earliest convenience. Looking forward to it, Commander. Holt out. The channel closed. I turned to Oreni. She was staring at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in over a year. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was hope. The Terran fleet held position alongside ours in the Drassic corridor through the night. I did not sleep. I spent the hours reviewing every scrap of sensor data we had captured during the battle, studying the Terran ships, their weapons, their tactics, their communications patterns. Everything about them was foreign. Their ships were built with an engineering philosophy that prioritized durability over elegance, raw toughness over precision. Where Rithani warships were designed to avoid taking hits, Terran vessels were designed to absorb them and keep fighting. Their weapons were even more striking. While the rest of the galaxy relied on directed energy systems and plasma-based ordnance, the Terrans used kinetic accelerators that launched solid metal projectiles at extraordinary velocities. The physics were simple, the damage was not. A Drekkar cruiser's shields could absorb energy weapons all day, but a 300-kilogram tungsten slug, moving at a significant fraction of light speed, did not care about shields. It punched through them, and through the hull behind them, and through whatever was behind that hull. Brutal, effective, and completely outside the Drekkar's tactical experience. By morning, I had compiled my full strategic briefing and transmitted it to the Terran flagship, which I had learned was named the Iron Meridian. It was a heavy battlecruiser, larger than anything in my fleet, with armor plating so thick that our sensors had difficulty penetrating it. The name itself was interesting, Meridian. I looked it up in our linguistic databases and found no match. Whatever language these Terrans spoke, it was their own. The meeting was arranged for midday, aboard my ship, the Stillwind. I chose my vessel because I wanted the Terrans to see the reality of our situation, the damage, the patched hull plates, the exhausted crew. I did not want to pretend we were stronger than we were. If these strangers were going to fight alongside us, they deserved to know the truth. The Terran shuttle docked at 1100 hours. I stood in the landing bay with Oreni and a small honor guard, watching the shuttle's ramp descend with a low hydraulic hiss. The first Terran I ever saw in person was Admiral Graham Holt. He was enormous. Not by galactic standards necessarily, but by mine. Where I stood at perhaps 1.5 meters, Holt was nearly 2 full meters tall, broad across the shoulders, with a thick neck and heavy limbs that moved with a kind of contained power. His skin was a warm brown, weathered, and lined around the eyes. His hair was dark, cut short, and streaked with gray at the temples. He wore a uniform of deep navy blue, simple and functional, with rank insignia I did not recognize, and a row of small colored ribbons on his chest that I later learned represented campaigns and honors. But it was his face that struck me most. Rithani faces are relatively still. Our expressions are subtle, communicated through wing positions, antenna movements, and small shifts in our compound eyes. This Terran's face was a landscape of expression. His eyes were deep brown and alert, scanning the landing bay with an intensity that was not threatening but was impossible to ignore. His mouth moved slightly as he took in the damaged bulkheads and the tired crew members who had stopped to stare at this alien giant. Behind him came 3 more Terrans. A tall female with red hair pulled back in a tight knot, a shorter male with dark skin and quick, calculating eyes, and a younger female carrying a data tablet and watching everything with an expression of intense curiosity. They were all tall. They were all broad. They moved with a coordinated confidence that reminded me of apex predators, not aggressive, but aware of their own strength. "Commander So," Holt said, extending one of his large hands. I had read enough of the briefing materials his ship had transmitted to understand the gesture. I reached out and placed my smaller hand in his. His grip was warm and firm, and he was clearly being careful not to squeeze too hard. "Admiral Holt. Welcome aboard the Stillwind. I apologize for the state of the vessel. We have been in continuous combat operations for some time. No apology necessary, Commander. A ship that is still fighting is a ship that is still in the war." He gestured to his companions. "This is Captain Charlotte Vane, my Fleet Operations Officer. Lieutenant Commander Derek Howe, Tactical Intelligence, and Lieutenant Helen Marsh, our Xenolinguistics Specialist." I nodded to each of them in turn. Captain Vane gave me a crisp nod that radiated professional competence. Howe studied me with those calculating eyes and offered a brief, polite greeting. Marsh smiled, and it was the first Terran smile I had ever seen. The expression transformed her face, pulling the corners of her mouth upward and crinkling the skin around her eyes, and it communicated warmth and openness in a way that transcended species. "Please," I said, "follow me to the briefing room." We walked through the corridors of the Stillwind, and I watched the Terrans absorb the reality of our war. They saw the welded hull patches, the scorched walls, the crew members, who were too thin and too tired, working double shifts because there were not enough people left to maintain a normal rotation. Charlotte Vane's expression tightened as she counted the damage markers. Derek Howe paused at a bulkhead where an explosive decompression had been sealed with emergency foam, and I saw his jaw clench. None of them said anything pitying or patronizing. They looked. They understood. They kept walking. The briefing room was the largest intact compartment on the ship, and I had prepared a full holographic display of the strategic situation. When the doors closed behind us and the display activated, the Rithani star map bloomed into blue light above the table, and Graham Holt got his first real look at how badly we were losing. 14 months ago, the Drekar Dominion issued an ultimatum demanding the complete absorption of the Rithani sovereignty into their empire. I began. We refused. They invaded. This was the extent of our territory at the start of the war. I highlighted the original borders, a respectable swath of space encompassing 9 star systems and 42 inhabited worlds. This is what remains. The highlighted area shrank to a thin sliver. 3 systems, our homeworld Rithara, and its 2 nearest neighbors. The room was silent. "We have lost 6 star systems, 39 inhabited worlds, and approximately 350 warships," I continued. "The Drekar currently control 70% of our former territory and have an active fleet strength estimated at over 400 warships. Our remaining military force consists of the 58 ships you fought beside yesterday." Holt leaned forward, studying the map with an intensity that made his brown eyes seem almost black. What about the other species in this region? The ones in your galactic organization? The Galactic Concord has declared non-intervention. 3 of our former allied species have signed separate peace agreements with the Drekar. We are alone. You were alone, Charlotte Vane said quietly, and something in the way she said it made my wings lift slightly from my back. Holt straightened. Commander, tell me about the Drekar. Not just numbers. How do they think? How do they fight? What do they want? I had been answering questions from Allied commanders and diplomatic envoys for 14 months, and every one of them had asked the same thing. How many ships? How many soldiers? What is the force ratio? Graham Holt was the first person who asked me how the enemy thought. I told him everything. The Drekar were a reptilian species, cold-blooded in both physiology and temperament. Their society was rigidly hierarchical, built around a military caste that controlled all aspects of government. They expanded through conquest because their entire economic and social system depended on it. Each new subjugated species provided labor, resources, and biological material that fed the Dominion's growth. They fought with overwhelming force, relying on numerical superiority and attritional tactics to grind opponents down. Their individual soldiers were larger and stronger than Rithani, though not particularly creative. Their officers were competent but predictable, favoring proven doctrines over innovation. Holt listened without interrupting. Derek Howe was taking rapid notes on a handheld device. Charlotte Vane was studying the star map with narrowed eyes, tracing the Drekar supply lines with her finger. When I finished, Holt sat back in his chair and looked at his officers. Some kind of unspoken communication passed between them. A glance, a slight nod, a raised eyebrow. It took less than 5 seconds. Commander So, Holt said, we are going to help you win this war. Not just survive it, win it. I stared at him. Admiral, with respect, your fleet is 43 warships. The Drekar have over 400. Even combined with our forces, we are outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Holt smiled. It was a different kind of smile than Helen Marsh's. There was warmth in it, but there was also something else. Something that looked almost eager. Commander, do you know what force multiplication is? I did not. It means you do not need to match the enemy ship for ship, he said. You need to make each of your ships worth 10 of theirs. And you do that by being smarter, faster, and meaner than they are. He leaned forward again. The Drekar are predictable. They rely on numbers. They follow doctrine. That means they can be disrupted, confused, and broken if you hit them in ways they do not expect. We have been doing this to larger enemies for our entire history. Charlotte Vane pulled up a new display on the holographic table. We have identified a primary target, she said. The Drekar Forward Supply Depot at Kelvan Station. According to your intelligence data, this single facility supports roughly 60% of the Drekar offensive logistics in this sector. Destroy it, and their advance toward your homeworld stalls. I looked at the display. Kelvan Station was a massive orbital platform in a heavily defended system, protected by a garrison fleet and extensive defensive installations. Every plan my staff had drafted to attack it had been rejected as requiring more ships than we could afford to lose. We have studied the defenses, Vane continued. They are formidable against a conventional fleet engagement, but they are not designed to counter a combined arms assault using both fleet action and direct boarding operations. Boarding operations? Oreni said, incredulity clear in her voice. You intend to physically board a military station defended by Drekar soldiers? That is exactly what we intend, Derek Howe said, and for the first time, his quiet voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like anticipation. We have Marine units trained specifically for hostile boarding actions. Put us on that station, and we will take it apart from the inside while your fleet and ours keep the garrison occupied. I looked at these Terrans, these impossible strangers from beyond the veil, and I tried to reconcile what I was hearing with everything I knew about warfare. No galactic species conducted boarding operations against defended military installations. The casualties would be catastrophic. The risks were insane. But then I remembered the battle in the corridor. I remembered watching a Terran destroyer lose its forward section and keep fighting. I remembered the way their ships had charged directly into the Drekar formation at ranges where a single hit could kill, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed my vessels, and pressing their attack without hesitation. These beings did not fight the way the rest of the galaxy fought. They fought as if the concept of acceptable risk had a much, much wider definition than anyone else in known space. "How soon can we execute this operation?" I asked. Holt looked at Vane. She consulted her datapad. 72 hours for planning and coordination. We will need full integration between our tactical systems and yours, and our marine units will need detailed schematics of the station. You will have everything we can provide, I said. The meeting continued for another 3 hours. We discussed logistics, communication protocols, fleet positioning, and 100 other operational details. But underneath all of that, something else was happening. Something I had not experienced in 14 months of war. I was planning an offensive, not a desperate defense, not a fighting retreat, an attack. A strike designed not just to survive, but to take something back, to hurt the enemy in a way that would change the trajectory of the war. When the meeting ended and the Terrans prepared to return to their shuttle, I walked beside Holt through the corridors. We passed a repair bay where Terran engineers had already begun working alongside Rithani crews, having crossed over from the Iron Meridian that morning with toolkits and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of energy. I stopped and watched. A Terran engineer, a stocky female with dark hair and grease-stained hands, named Corporal Fiona Drake, was crouched beside a Rithani power conduit that had been jury-rigged so many times it looked like a piece of abstract art. She was studying it with furrowed brows. A Rithani technician stood nearby, trying to explain the modifications through the language barrier and a lot of hand gestures. Drake nodded, pulled a multi-tool from her belt, and in 20 minutes built an adapter from scrap metal and spare parts that bridged two incompatible systems and restored power flow to an entire deck that had been running on emergency reserves for a week. The Rithani technician stared at the adapter. Then he looked at Drake. She grinned at him and said something in her language that made the other Terran engineers laugh. "Your people work fast," I said to Holt. "We like fixing things," he said simply, "especially things that other people have given up on." I looked at him. In that moment, standing in the damaged corridor of my battered flagship, watching Terran and Rithani crews work side by side for the first time in history, I understood something about these beings that went beyond their ships and their weapons and their willingness to fight. They did not help because it was strategically advantageous. They did not help because they expected payment or territory or political leverage. They helped because they could, because someone needed it, because in whatever culture and history had shaped this strange, powerful species, the act of hearing someone in pain and choosing to respond was not a calculation. It was a reflex. "Admiral," I said as we reached the shuttle bay, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Go ahead." "Why did you come? Truly, you had never heard of us. You crossed unknown space to fight in a stranger's war. Why?" Holt paused at the base of the shuttle ramp. He turned to face me, and that broad, weathered face was serious and calm. "Commander, back home we have a saying. I do not know if it translates well, but I will try. When you hear someone calling for help in the dark, you do not check their identification before you turn on the light." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked up the ramp. I stood in the shuttle bay long after his ship had departed, feeling something I had almost forgotten how to feel. 72 hours later, the combined Rithani-Terran fleet moved against Kelvon Station, and the second phase of the war began. The assault on Kelvon Station was the most complex military operation I had ever been part of, and the first one in 14 months that I approached with something other than dread. The plan was Charlotte Vane's creation, refined through 3 days of intense collaboration between Terran and Rithani officers. It was unlike any battle plan my people had ever conceived, not because it was more sophisticated than our own tactical thinking, but because it combined elements that no Rithani commander would have considered putting together: fleet action and ground assault, deception and brute force, precision strikes and close-quarters combat. The Terrans did not choose between these approaches. They used all of them simultaneously. My role was to lead the Rathani fleet element in a diversionary attack on the station's outer defense perimeter. We would draw the Drekhar garrison fleet away from the station itself, opening a window for the Terran assault ships to close with the station and deploy their marine boarding teams. Meanwhile, Holt's main battle group would position itself to cut off any Drekhar reinforcements arriving from neighboring systems. It was a plan built on timing, coordination, and the assumption that the Drekhar would react predictably. After 14 months of fighting them, I was confident in that assumption. The Drekhar were many things, but innovative was not one of them. We launched at dawn on the 4th day. The Kelvon system was a binary star arrangement, 2 orange suns orbiting each other in a slow, ancient dance, with Kelvon station positioned at the gravitational midpoint between them. The station itself was enormous, a military logistics hub the size of a small city, ringed with weapons platforms and docking arms full of cargo haulers and fuel tankers. Destroying it would be like cutting a major artery in the Drekhar war machine. My diversionary force jumped in first, 34 Rathani warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel on the station's outer perimeter and immediately engaging the defensive platforms. The Drekhar garrison fleet, 26 ships strong, scrambled to intercept exactly as Vane had predicted. They formed up in a defensive screen between my ships and the station, trading fire across 20,000 kilometers of space. I did not try to win this engagement. I just needed to keep their attention. My ships danced along the edge of their weapons range, firing and withdrawing, keeping the garrison fleet oriented toward us and away from the station's far side. 12 minutes into the diversionary action, I received a single coded burst from Holt. Package delivered. The Terran marine assault ships had reached the station. I had no direct visual feed of what happened inside Kelvon Station. What I had was a tactical data link that Charlotte Vane had established between our fleets, a shared information system that gave me a real-time overlay of the boarding operation. Blue dots for Terran Marines, red dots for Drekhar defenders. I watched the operation unfold on my bridge display, with my hearts pounding against my ribs. The Marines hit the station in 3 simultaneous breaching operations, cutting through the hull at points that the Drekhar had not anticipated, because no sane military force would attempt a direct hull breach on an active military installation. The Terrans did it with shaped charges and plasma cutters, blowing holes in the station's skin and pouring through into the interior before the defenders could react. The first thing I noticed was the speed. Terran Marines moved through the station's corridors with a fluid, aggressive efficiency that was almost terrifying to watch, even in the abstract form of tactical dots on a screen. They advanced in fire teams, clearing junctions and compartments with coordinated precision, covering each other's movements in a way that suggested they had trained for exactly this kind of operation thousands of times. The second thing I noticed was that the Drekhar were struggling. The Drekhar were physically imposing soldiers, scaled and muscular, bred for combat. In open-field engagements, they were devastating. But inside the confined corridors of Kelvon Station, their size became a disadvantage, and the Terran Marines exploited it ruthlessly. The Marines used the station's architecture against the defenders, setting up kill zones at corridor intersections, collapsing access routes to channel the Drekhar into ambush points, and advancing through maintenance shafts and ventilation systems that the larger Drekhar could not fit through. One engagement in particular stood out on the tactical feed. A squad of 12 Terran Marines, led by a sergeant whose transponder identified her as Sergeant Priya Kessler, reached the station's primary reactor control room and found it defended by a full Drekhar infantry platoon of approximately 50 soldiers. They were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Kessler's squad held a corridor junction leading to the reactor room for 9 minutes. 9 minutes against 50 Drekhar soldiers. The tactical feed showed her squad's positions shifting and adapting in real time, pulling back, advancing, flanking through side passages, collapsing structural barriers to create choke points, using every square meter of the station's interior to neutralize the Drekhar's numerical advantage. 3 Marines were hit and injured during the engagement. None of them stopped fighting. After 9 minutes, the Terran demolition team reached the reactor room from a secondary access route and placed their charges. Kessler's squad withdrew. The reactor went critical 40 seconds later, and the resulting power cascade tore through the station's core systems like a chain of falling dominoes. The lights on Kelvon Station went out, emergency systems activated, but by then, the Terran Marines had already completed their primary objectives. The station's fuel reserves were venting into space, its weapons platforms were offline, its communications array was destroyed. The Drekhar garrison fleet, suddenly facing a crippled station and a Rithani force that was no longer pulling its punches, found itself in an impossible position. I pressed my attack, driving my ships forward with an aggression that surprised even my own officers, and the Drekhar defensive screen began to crack. Holt's main battle group arrived 10 minutes later, dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly behind the Drekhar garrison fleet. The Drekhar were caught between my force and Holt's heavy warships, with a dying station at their backs and no reinforcements coming. The Drekhar garrison commander, to her credit, fought hard. She managed to extract 11 of her 26 ships before the trap closed completely. The remaining 15 were destroyed or disabled. Kelvon Station, the logistical backbone of the Drekhar offensive in our sector, was gone. I stood on the bridge of the Stillwind and watched the station's shattered remains drift through the orange light of the binary suns, and I felt something I had not felt in 14 months. Victory. Not a Pyrrhic survival, not a narrowly avoided catastrophe, an actual, decisive, strategic victory that would change the course of the war. The cost was not insignificant. I had lost 4 ships in the diversionary action, and the Terran Marines had taken casualties during the boarding operation. 17 Marines had been wounded, and 5 had been killed, the first Terran deaths in a war that was not their own. When the fleet regrouped in the outer system and the butcher's bill was tallied, I requested permission to come aboard the Iron Meridian. Holt granted it. I found him in the ship's medical bay, standing beside the bed of a wounded Marine. The young man was sedated, his left arm immobilized in a field cast, his face pale under a layer of grime and dried sweat. Holt stood over him with a stillness that was different from his usual contained energy. It was the stillness of a man looking at a consequence. "Corporal Eddie Rowan," Holt said without turning. 22 years old. He was part of the breach team on the station's north docking arm. A piece of shrapnel went through his armor above the elbow. "Will he recover?" I asked. "The medics say yes, full recovery. He will be back on duty in 6 weeks. Holt paused. "That does not make it easier." I stood beside him and looked at the young Terran's sleeping face. He was barely more than a child by Rithani standards. He had traveled across unknown space to fight in a war he had no stake in, and a piece of enemy metal had torn through his flesh. "Admiral," I said, "your people died today. For us. For a species they had never met before this week." Holt turned to face me. His expression was controlled, but I could see the effort it took. His eyes were bright with something that was not quite grief and not quite anger. "They knew the risks, Commander. Every one of them volunteered for this deployment. Nobody was ordered into that boarding action. I asked for volunteers, and every single Marine in the fleet stepped forward." He paused. "That is who we are. That is what we do." "It should not have been necessary," I said, and the bitterness in my own voice surprised me. "If the Concord had acted, if our allies had honored their obligations, your people would not be bleeding in our war." "Maybe," Holt said, "but they did not act, and we are here. We cannot change what others chose not to do. We can only decide what we are willing to do." He straightened, and the composure returned to his face. "Now, tell me about the Drekhar's next move." The next days confirmed what we had hoped and feared in equal measure. With Kelvon Station destroyed, the Drekhar offensive machine ground to a halt. Supply lines that had fed their push toward Rithara collapsed overnight. Forward units, that had been pressing our remaining defenses, suddenly found themselves without fuel, without ammunition, without the logistical support that kept a modern fleet operational. The Drekhar had relied on centralized supply infrastructure, and we had knocked out its linchpin. But the relief was temporary. Intelligence reports gathered from captured Drekhar communications and analysis of fleet movements told a darker story. The Drekhar Supreme Military Commander, Warlord Kithan, was consolidating his forces. Every ship that could be pulled from garrison duty, every reserve unit, every vessel in the Dominion shipyards that was close enough to completion, was being assembled into a single massive armada. The target was obvious: Rithara. Kethion intended to end the war with one overwhelming strike. He would gather every warship the Dominion could field and throw them directly at our homeworld. No more incremental advances. No more grinding attrition. One battle. Total victory. Derek Howe laid out the intelligence assessment in a joint briefing aboard the Stillwind. Based on our projections, the Drekar will complete their consolidation within 3 to 4 weeks, he said. At that point, Warlord Kethon will command a fleet of approximately 320 warships, including his command carrier, and at least 15 heavy battleships. This force will advance directly toward Rythara through the Drassic Corridor. The room was silent. I looked at our combined force roster. 54 surviving Rithani warships, 41 surviving Terran warships, 95 ships against 320. Admiral, I said, you mentioned that a larger Terran fleet was being assembled. Holt nodded. The 2nd Expeditionary Fleet under Vice Admiral Susan Cross, 112 warships, but they are still in transit, and at current speed, they will not arrive for another 4 to 5 weeks. Then they will be too late, Oreni said flatly. Not necessarily, Charlotte Vane replied. If we can delay the Drekar assault by even a week, or if the 2nd Fleet can accelerate their transit, the timing could work. Could, Oreni repeated. A great deal rests on that word. Holt leaned forward, his thick forearms resting on the briefing table. Commander So, I will be honest with you. The numbers are bad. If the Drekar arrive before our reinforcements, we will be fighting at more than 3 to 1 odds. I am not going to pretend those are comfortable margins. Then what do you recommend? I asked. We fight, Holt said. We take every advantage we can find. We prepare the best defensive position possible around Rythara. We coordinate every asset, every weapon, every ship we have. And we hold the line until the 2nd Fleet arrives. And if they do not arrive in time? Holt held my gaze. Then we hold the line until they do. There was no bravado in his voice. No theatrical defiance, just a simple, factual statement from a man who had already decided that retreat was not an option. Not because he was foolish, but because he understood what was behind him. 12 billion lives, a civilization, the last light of a species that the galaxy had written off. I looked at Oreni. She looked back at me, and I saw in her compound eyes the same thing I felt in my own chest. If these Terrans were willing to die defending our homeworld, we could do no less. Then we prepare, I said, together. The next 3 weeks were the most intense and exhausting of my life. The combined Rithani-Terran command staff worked around the clock to transform Rythara's orbital space into a fortress. We mined approach vectors. We repositioned defensive satellites. We integrated Terran weapons systems with Rithani shield technology, creating hybrid defensive platforms that were stronger than either system alone. We drilled combined fleet maneuvers until our 2 navies could operate as one coherent force. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something I had not anticipated. Word of Kelvon Station had spread. The Galactic Concord, which had unanimously voted to abandon us, was suddenly paying very close attention. The sudden appearance of an unknown species from beyond the outer veil, a species that had arrived uninvited, fought ferociously, and won a significant victory, had sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. 2 of the species that had signed non-aggression pacts with the Drekar quietly reached out through back channels. The Pellini Federation and the Sular Directorate both sent diplomatic feelers, expressing concern for regional stability and interest in exploring collaborative security arrangements. The language was careful and non-committal. The words of governments that wanted to be on the winning side, but were not yet sure which side that was. I felt a surge of bitterness when I read their communications. Where were these expressions of concern when Sathara Prime was burning? Where was this interest in collaboration when my fleet was being ground down to nothing? I said as much to Holt during a late-night planning session. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Take their help." They abandoned us. I know, take their help anyway. How can you say that? You have seen what their cowardice cost my people. I have, and when this war is over, there will be time for accountability. But right now, every ship that stands between the Drekar and your homeworld is a ship that might save lives. Your pride is justified, Commander, but it is not more important than your people's survival. I wanted to argue. I wanted to hold on to the anger. Because the anger was cleaner and simpler than the alternative, which was accepting help from those who had let us bleed. But he was right, and I knew it. I authorized contact with the Peleni and the Sular. They were not ready to commit warships, not yet, but they offered intelligence sharing and logistical support. It was not much, but it was something. 3 weeks and 4 days after the destruction of Kelvon Station, our long-range sensors detected the Drekhar Armada. They came like a tide of iron. 309 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Rithara system, their formation so vast that it took our sensors nearly a minute to fully resolve the fleet's composition. At the center of the Armada flew the Drekhar Supreme Command Carrier, the Fist of Dominion, a 4-kilometer behemoth that served as Warlord Kethan's personal flagship and mobile command center. Around it clustered heavy battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and assault carriers. More warships in one place than I had ever seen in my entire career. I stood on the bridge of the Stillwind and felt the blood drain from my face. 93 ships. That was what we had. 52 Rithani warships and 41 Terran vessels, arrayed in a layered defensive formation around Rithara's orbital space. Behind us, 12 billion Rithani civilians went about their lives, trusting that the flashes of light in their night sky were their protectors, not their doom. All ships, battle stations, I said. This is it. Holt's voice came through the fleet channel from the Iron Meridian, positioned at the center of our formation. All Terran vessels, weapons free on my command. Remember your training. Remember why we are here. The Drekhar fleet advanced. They did not hurry. Kethion knew his numbers. He knew that time was on his side, that every minute brought his fleet closer to optimal engagement range, and he had no reason to rush. His formation was textbook, a massive wedge designed to concentrate firepower on our center, while his flanking elements swept around to envelop us. At 50,000 kilometers, the first long-range salvos began. Drekhar plasma lances reached out across the void, bright spears of superheated energy probing our defensive line. Our shields flickered and held. We returned fire, Rithani energy batteries and Terran kinetic accelerators, sending death back toward the oncoming armada. At 30,000 kilometers, the real battle began. The Drekhar Center drove directly toward our formation, with the weight of nearly 100 heavy warships. Holt's Terran battle group met them head-on, the Iron Meridian leading the charge with its main kinetic batteries blazing. The impact was colossal. Ships on both sides were struck and damaged in the opening exchange, and within the first 5 minutes, we had lost 3 ships, and the Drekhar had lost 5. The math was wrong. We were trading losses at a ratio we could not sustain. For every ship we killed, the Drekhar had 6 more behind it. But we held. On the port flank, my Rithani strike wings engaged the Drekhar flanking force with hit-and-run tactics, darting in and out of our minefields, using the defensive satellites as cover. We could not stop the flank, but we could slow it, and every minute we slowed it was a minute the center held. On the starboard flank, a mixed Rithani-Terran squadron fought a brutal delaying action against another Drekhar flanking element. The fighting was savage, ships exchanging fire at ranges so close that they could see the hull markings on each other's vessels. A Terran frigate, the Resolute Dawn, was struck by a concentrated plasma barrage that melted through her port armor and detonated her forward magazine. She broke apart in a flash of white light, and the 240 souls aboard her were gone in an instant. The battle raged for 2 hours. We lost ships. The Drekhar lost more, but they had more to lose, and the ratio was slowly, inevitably grinding against us. At the 90-minute mark, Warlord Kethan broadcast a message on an open channel, transmitted on all frequencies, so that both fleets and the civilian population on Rithara below could hear it. Rithani Commander, unknown allies. This is Supreme Warlord Kethanon of the Drekhar Dominion. Your defense is brave but futile. You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I will guarantee the safety of the civilian population. Continue to resist, and I will reduce your homeworld to ash. You have 5 minutes to respond. The fleet channel went silent. Every bridge, every crew member, every officer in our combined fleet waited. Graham Holt's voice came through, calm and steady, broadcast on the same open frequency so that Kethon and every Drekar ship could hear it. Warlord Kethon, this is Rear Admiral Graham Holt of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We appreciate the offer, but we are going to have to decline. We did not come all this way to give up, and for the record, I want to make sure you understand something. You are not fighting one dying species and a handful of strangers anymore. You have picked a fight with humanity, and we do not stop. The channel crackled with silence. Then the Drekar fleet accelerated, and the final phase of the battle began. The next 40 minutes were the longest of my life. The Drekar threw everything they had at our defensive line, and we threw everything back. Ships burned on both sides. The space around Rithara was choked with debris, with atmosphere venting from ruptured hulls, with the bright flares of missiles and the silent explosions of vessels being torn apart. The Stillwind took a direct hit from a Drekar battleship's main battery that tore through our port engine array and killed 6 members of my engineering crew. The impact threw me against the command rail hard enough to crack 2 of my ribs. I pulled myself up and kept fighting, because there was nothing else to do. Holt's Iron Meridian was hit even harder. A concentrated salvo from 3 Drekar cruisers penetrated the battlecruiser's thick armor and destroyed her main power plant. The ship went dark, drifting, her weapons silent. For one terrible moment I thought Holt was dead. Then a transmission came through from the destroyer North Point, a small, battered ship that had been part of Holt's escort screen. This is Admiral Holt. I have transferred my flag to the North Point. All Terran ships, continue the fight. Do not give them 1 more meter. He was alive. He had evacuated from his dying flagship to a destroyer, a fraction of the Iron Meridian's size, and he was still commanding the fleet from a ship that had no business being anyone's flagship. That was the moment I understood something fundamental about these beings. They did not stop. Defeat was not a concept they accepted. You could destroy their ship, wound their bodies, kill their friends, and they would find another ship, bind their wounds, mourn later, and keep fighting with whatever they had left. The battle reached its crisis point at the 2-hour and 40-minute mark. Our defensive line was bending dangerously. We had lost 29 ships, more than a quarter of our force, and the Drekar were pushing through gaps in our formation. Kethon's command carrier had moved up to close range, its massive weapons batteries adding their weight to the assault. I was preparing to order a contraction of our defensive perimeter, pulling our surviving ships into a tighter formation around Rithara for a last stand, when Selith shouted from his console. "Commander! Faster than light signatures, massive signatures, bearing 005, declination 2, above the ecliptic plane." My blood went cold. If the Drekar had reinforcements, it was over. "How many contacts?" I demanded. Selith's hands flew across his console. Then he stopped. He turned to look at me, and his face wore an expression I had seen only once before, in the Jurassic Corridor, when the first Terran ships arrived. 114 contacts, Commander. Terran drive signatures. The 2nd Expeditionary Fleet. Vice Admiral Susan Cross brought 114 warships out of faster-than-light travel above the plane of the Rithara system, positioning her fleet directly behind the Drekar armada. The timing was devastating. Kethon's fleet, fully committed to its assault on our defensive line, suddenly found itself caught between our remaining forces and a fresh, full-strength Terran battle fleet. Cross wasted no time. Her ships opened fire the moment they were in range, their kinetic batteries sending a hurricane of tungsten into the Drekar rear. The effect was catastrophic. Drekar ships that had been pressing forward into our battered formation were suddenly taking hits from behind, their aft shields and armor far thinner than their forward protection. Ships that had been winning their individual engagements a moment ago were suddenly fighting for survival. The Drekar formation shattered. There is no other word for it. The disciplined, overwhelming armada that had been grinding us down simply fell apart as ships broke formation to evade Cross's assault, colliding with each other's firing arcs, losing coordination, losing cohesion. In the space of 15 minutes, the Drekar went from winning the battle to losing it. Kethon ordered a retreat. It was the only rational decision, but it came too late for most of his fleet. Cross's ships blocked the primary withdrawal routes, and my force and Holt's surviving ships pressed forward into the disintegrating Drekar formation. The result was not a battle anymore. It was a rout. The Drekar lost 173 warships at Rithara, more than half their total force. Kethon's command carrier, the Fist of Dominion, managed to escape with a battered escort of approximately 60 ships, fleeing into faster-than-light travel, with Cross's destroyers snapping at their heels. The war was effectively over. I stood on the bridge of the Stillwind, my ribs aching, my bridge crew weeping at their stations, and I watched the last Drekar warships disappear from our sensors. Below us, Rithara turned slowly in the light of its star, green and silver and alive. We had won. The days that followed were a blur of logistics, diplomacy, and grief. The Drekar Dominion, its military shattered and its offensive capability destroyed, sued for an armistice within a week. The terms were negotiated by a joint Rithani-Terran delegation, and they were firm. Full withdrawal from all occupied Rithani territory. Reparations, demilitarization of the Drekar border regions, an independent monitoring force to ensure compliance. The Galactic Concord, which had voted unanimously to abandon us, scrambled to adjust to the new reality. The sudden appearance of humanity, a previously unknown civilization, with significant military power, and an apparent willingness to project that power on behalf of strangers, had upended every diplomatic calculation in known space. Species that had ignored our pleas for help were now desperately eager to establish relations with Earth, not out of moral awakening, but out of pragmatic fear that a species willing to fight for the Rithani might be less willing to tolerate those who had stood by and watched. The Pellini Federation formally apologized for their non-aggression pact with the Drekar. The Sular Directorate offered economic aid. The Gress Communion said nothing at all, which I thought was probably the most honest response of the three. 6 weeks after the battle, a ceremony was held on the surface of Rithera. It was held in the Memorial Gardens of Thessera, an ancient park in the capital city, where generations of Rithani had honored their fallen. Today, for the first time in our history, we were honoring the fallen of another species alongside our own. 43 Terran service members had died in the war. 43 men and women who had traveled across unknown space to fight for a civilization they owed nothing to, and who would never go home. Their names were inscribed on the memorial wall beside the names of every Rithani soldier who had given their life in the defense of our people. The inscriptions were in both Rithani script and Terran English, the angular characters of our language standing alongside the curved letters of theirs. I stood before the assembled crowd, Rithani dignitaries and citizens on one side, Terran military personnel on the other, and I spoke. 14 months ago, my people stood at the edge of extinction. Our allies had abandoned us. Our enemies were closing in. Every calculation, every projection, every rational analysis said the same thing. We were finished. The Rithani sovereignty would end, and the galaxy would go on without us. And within a generation, no one would remember we had existed. I paused. The gardens were silent. The wind moved through the ancient trees overhead, carrying the scent of the flowers that generations of my people had planted in remembrance. And then, from beyond the outer veil, from a region of space that every galactic chart marked as empty, came a signal, a voice none of us had ever heard, speaking a language none of us understood, saying the simplest words in the universe: "We are here to help." I looked at Graham Holt. He stood in the front row of the Terran delegation, wearing his dress uniform, his face composed and still. Beside him stood Charlotte Vane, Derek Howe, Helen Marsh, and behind them, row upon row of Terran officers and enlisted personnel, scarred and proud and alive. The Iron Meridian was gone, destroyed in the battle above Rithara. 11 other Terran warships had been lost, 43 Terran lives had been given, and not one of them had been owed to us. The galaxy has many powerful species, I continued, species with great fleets and vast empires and ancient civilizations. When we called to them for help, they calculated the cost of intervention, measured it against their interests, and decided that our survival was not worth the price. That is their right. That is the rational choice. The humans did not make the rational choice. The humans heard a stranger screaming in the dark, and they came running. Not because they knew us, not because they owed us, not because it served their strategic interests. They came because it was right, because in their hearts, in whatever deep and powerful place that defines what a species truly is, they believed that you do not let someone die alone when you have the strength to stand beside them. I felt my voice waver and steadied it. The Galactic Concord asked what the cost of intervention would be. The humans never asked that question. They asked a different one. They asked what kind of people they wanted to be. And then they showed us the answer. 43 of them will never go home. Their names are on this wall now, alongside our own dead, because they earned that place. They earned it with courage, with sacrifice, and with a kind of compassion that this galaxy has not seen before, and must never be allowed to forget. I turned to face Holt directly. Admiral, on behalf of the Rithani sovereignty, on behalf of 12 billion lives that exist today because of what your people chose to do, I say this. You came when no one else would. You fought when no one else dared. You died for a people you had never met, in a war you did not start, because you believed it was the right thing to do. We will never forget, for as long as the Rithani exist, for as long as there are stars in this sky and words in our language, we will remember what humanity did for us. And if the day ever comes when your people send a signal into the dark, when you are the ones who need help, and the galaxy turns its back, I swear to you, we will come, as you came for us. Without hesitation, without calculation, without limit. Holt held my gaze. His expression did not change, but I saw his jaw tighten, and I saw the brightness in his eyes, and I understood that behind the composure and the calm command presence, Graham Holt was a man who felt everything and chose to carry it without complaint. He nodded once, a small, simple gesture, an acknowledgement between two commanders who had fought together and lost people together and survived together. The crowd was silent. Then, slowly, from the Rithani side of the assembly, a sound began. A low, rising hum, the Rithani expression of deepest honor, a vibration that came from the wings and resonated in the chest. It was a sound we made only for the most sacred moments, for the passing of leaders, for the remembrance of heroes. Thousands of voices joined in, the hum building and building, until it filled the gardens and rose into the sky above Thesara. And then something happened that I had never imagined. From the Terran side of the assembly, the humans responded. Not with a hum. They did not have wings. But one of them began to clap, slowly, a single pair of large hands striking together in a steady, deliberate rhythm. Then another joined. Then another. Then all of them, hundreds of Terran hands beating together in a sound like distant thunder, a sound that carried its own weight and its own meaning. The Rithani hum and the Terran applause blended together, two species expressing the same thing in their own way, and the sound of it rolled across the memorial gardens like a living thing. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. We had lost all hope. I need you to understand that. Completely, totally, without reservation, we had lost all hope. We had been abandoned by everyone we trusted, and we were waiting to die. And then they came. From beyond the edge of everything we knew, from a place we had never mapped and a people we had never met. They came because we asked, and because asking was enough. That is what the galaxy learned about humanity. Not their weapons, though their weapons were formidable. Not their ships, though their ships were nearly indestructible. Not their tactics or their technology or their numbers. What the galaxy learned was this. When you are alone in the dark, and the universe has decided you are not worth saving, the humans will disagree. And they will come for you. And they will fight for you. And they will stand beside you until the last star burns out. Because that is who they are. That is what they showed us. That is what they gave us. And that is why, of all the words in all the languages in this vast and indifferent galaxy, the ones that mean the most to me will always be the first ones I heard from the far side of the outer veil, crackling through static and distance and the impossible dark. We received your distress signal. We are here to help.